Welcome to the American Hospital Association's webinar for trustees on the role of the board chair. I am pleased to introduce our presenter. Jamie Orlikoff is president of Orlikoff & Associates, an international consulting firm specializing in healthcare governance and leadership, strategy, quality, organizational development, and risk management. Long recognized as one of the leading experts in the governance field, Jamie has consulted with hospitals and systems in 11 countries, and since 1985 has worked with hospital and system governing boards to strengthen their overall effectiveness and their oversight of strategy and quality. He has served on hospital, college, and civic boards and is currently a member of the Virginia Mason Health System Board in Seattle, where he is chair of their governance committee. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Jamie Orlikoff.
Thank you very much. And today in this webinar, we're going to be focusing on the role of the board chair, one of the most critical governance roles, key interface between the board and the chief executive officer, and crucial determinant of the effectiveness of the board, and yet, surprisingly, one of the most ill-defined and poorly understood positions. And so just to kind of give a little indication of where we're going, is that ineffective board chair relationships with the chief executive officer and with the full board tend to be a function of personality-driven governance, and effective relationships tend to be a function of principle-based relationships. And so that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. So I thought I'd start with a quote from C.S. Lewis, which I like very much. One never can see why anyone was selected for any job, and when one does, it usually some reason that leaves no room for vanity. And so this frequently will be the case, especially when no one's interested in seeking the position of board chair. But let's jump in and consider, so first of all, some obvious points. A crucial and significant part of a board's effectiveness depends upon the quality of its leadership, the board chair. But yet there are many, many problems with typical chair positions for many, many hospital and health system and health-related boards around the country. Surprisingly, very few of them have a written job description. And by this I mean more than a one-sentence or even a one-paragraph statement in the bylaws. I'm talking about a thought-out, written job description which outlines the scope of authority, responsibility, expectations of the board chair. By the same token, I'm amazed at how rarely there is a formal mechanism for orientation to the position of board chair for an incoming board chair. Rather, there's an expectation that you've been on the board, you've seen how the previous chair performed, you know the job, just jump right in. In addition, there's no mechanism or criteria for routine performance evaluation, and in fact, that's going to be the subject of another webinar that we're doing on how to conduct and set up a meaningful board chair performance evaluation process. In addition to those, and those are really some key foundational ones, there typically tends not to be any mechanism for performance feedback based on that evaluation. So many chairs find themselves in a position where they'd actually like to get some feedback about how they're doing, but there is no mechanism for doing that, and the board or the chief executive officer is reluctant to do it, and so as a result, you get kind of a cone of silence mentality. Broader issues tend to relate to this. They're frequently conflicting and implicit unspoken expectations about what the purpose of the position of the board chair is. A typical kind of paradox would be the expectation that a board chair is supposed to keep things the way they've always been and at the same time preside over a process of sweeping change. Another problem, surprisingly, is lack of term limits, and so as a result it's very common to find board chair positions which are filled by the same person for 9, 10, or 25 years, which then creates a lack of leadership continuity. So looking at the flip side of that, what are some of the characteristics of effective board chairs? And again, this goes beyond personal characteristics. These are more characteristics of policy and principle. And so some of them are they undergo initial and ongoing leadership training, and they have a formal orientation to the position. There is a statement included in the job description which outlines not just their job, but also outlines how much time it will take them to perform this job, and the board chair, prior to assuming that role, understands this time commitment and commits to fulfilling it. There is also a formal kind of understanding that's gleaned through orientation and education about the organization, the history, and the strategy, as well as the unique governance culture and governance processes within the organization. And it's surprising that occasionally you'll find board chairs who are not well grounded in this. And then there is a conscious effort to create a structured and defined working and strategic partnership between the board chair and the chief executive officer within the context of a clearly defined understanding of what the board chair's role is vis-a-vis communicating between the board's oversight function and the chief executive officer role. And that's something we'll spend a little bit more time talking about. So those tend to be some of the characteristics. Others are, in addition to what we've talked about, the board chair understands the various leadership groups and leadership structures within the hospital and the system. And the larger the system is, the more complex these tend to be, because it goes beyond just board management and medical staff, but can also include clinically integrated networks, multiple boards, large numbers of senior executives, accountable care organizations, as well as leadership structures for aligned organizations, multiple hospitals, subacute long-term care, and so on. So really understanding not just that particular board, but also how it fits in the context of the broader leadership structure of the system. Then you begin to get into some of the characteristics that tend to be more a function of the person, ability to communicate clearly, consistently, and effectively. And if someone doesn't have this ability, it's usually very difficult to teach it, and so that then tends to become a criteria for selection. Willingness to follow established board goals and objectives and board work plans. An individual who will accept accountability and accept the fact that their performance will be subject to formal evaluation and that they will be getting feedback. And then someone who is demonstrated as a member of the board that they are not just willing but able to place the interest of the organization and the board above their own interests and their own desires, and then also that they understand and are willing to follow term limits. And so as a result, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, unless these are done, unless the position and the duties and the roles and responsibilities and the authority, and notice that I put a parenthetical, if any, and that's a really important point, because one of the characteristics of an effective board chair job description is a very, very clear delineation of what, if any, authority that the board chair position has. This is not left implicit. It is not left vague. It is made very, very clear. And in general, the rule is the authority of the board derives from the group as a whole. And no individual, including the board chair, has any authority unless it is specifically delegated to that position by the board. So it is in the board chair job description where any authority would be delegated, and I think you can tell by how I'm approaching this that my recommendation is, if any authority is in fact delegated to the board chair, it is very limited and very prescribed. And there are many, many effective board chairs where they have no authority, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. So again, to restate the point, if you don't have this, then you have personality-driven chairpersonship and personality-driven governance. And you have this when the function of the board changes and varies wildly when you get a new board chair. In effective boards, the function of the board tends to be relatively consistent regardless of who is the board chair. And this is what is meant by principle or policy-driven governance as opposed to personality-driven governance. And so how do we move away toward personality-driven governance and move toward principle and policy-related governance? The first one is to understand that many people will have their own past experience with other governance models, or they may have been chairs of different boards, and they will have their own implicit answers to a set of questions. And the key is to ask these questions explicitly and have the board agree to them. And these questions, the answers to them, hopefully will be consistent, but then form the foundation for the written job description for the board chair. So here are some kind of principles and some questions, and you'll notice I have kind of a bullet point, and following the bullet point is the opposite. And so I've stated these as statements, and you have to pick between them, and each board does. And I will tell you my bias. Every statement immediately following the bullet point is what I believe is a kind of principle of good governance. So let's take a look at some of them. Here are some choices. The board has the ultimate authority, or the board chair has the ultimate authority. Now, this may seem rather obvious, but unless it is explicitly asked and answered, it can cause all kinds of problems if the board chair believes or comes to believe that they have authority, which in fact is the appropriate purview of the board. My strong recommendation in the consensus of best practice governance thinking is that the board has the ultimate authority. The second principle is, and now hopefully these will all flow and be consistent, if in your board you agree the board has the ultimate authority, that means the second principle, you've basically answered it. Is the chair accountable to the board, or is the board accountable to the chair? And if the board has the ultimate authority, then it makes sense that the chair should be accountable to the board. In other words, the board, one of the board's responsibilities is overseeing the board chair, and if the board chair behaves in a way which is regarded as being inappropriate, there are mechanisms to both communicate that to the board chair and correct the board chair's behavior. The third point, the chair is a facilitator of governance, or is the chair a director and a controller of governance? And once again, if you've answered those first two questions, that the board has the ultimate authority, the chair is accountable to the board, then here you're much more likely to answer this question, that the chair is primarily a facilitator of governance process, a facilitator of information flow, a facilitator of communication between the board and the chief executive officer, as opposed to being a director and a controller of those characteristics. So those are some of the polemical questions that you have to ask and answer. What are other ones? And this next one is absolutely crucial. And if you've answered the first three in the way in which I've suggested, then the answers to these should also be kind of self-evident as well. So now here's one of the key questions that must be made explicit. Who is the boss of the chief executive officer? Is it the board as a whole, or is it the board chair? And amazingly, this question is frequently not explicitly answered anywhere. And so as a result, you can have a lot of confusion that results from these unspoken expectations and implicit assumptions, especially if a board chair begins to behave in a way which would indicate that he or she is the boss of the CEO. So my strong recommendation is that you pick that first one. The CEO reports to the board as a whole. The board as a whole is the boss of the chief executive officer, not the board chair. And if, in fact, you agree with that, then what you need to do is say, well, what is the role, then, of the board chair in terms of facilitating communication between the board and the CEO? But it all starts with kind of that foundational choice. The next one, and now what we're really talking about is kind of a principle which is known as balance the power structure. You want to be very careful about giving too much authority to any individual, i.e. the board chair, or any board committee. So here the choice is, does the board have a process where the full board appoints the chairs and the members of the executive committee, if you have one, and the other board committees? Or is the chair invested with the authority to appoint the chairs and the members of the executive committee and of other board committees? And again, I recommend the first one. Why? Because if the chair has the authority to appoint the chairs of the various committees and the members of the committees, that invests a tremendous amount of power in that one individual. So what you can see here is, consistent with these first points, we're creating a set of questions which, if you answer them consistently, will create a job description which emphasizes the authority of the board as a whole and de-emphasizes any authority for the individual board chair. And then if you have an executive committee, you ask the same questions. Does the executive executive committee control the board, or is it accountable to the board? And obviously, you can guess my bias. The executive committee should be accountable to the board. So if I'm a chief executive officer and I'm a new hire and I come in and I look at this written job description, it will become very clear to me that my boss is the full board. The board chair is not my boss. The executive committee is not my boss. They may have a role in my performance evaluation, but they do not have hire and fire authority over me, nor can they give me instructions or directions which are inconsistent with any instructions or directions I've been given by the board. So to my way of thinking, those are the basic questions which really need to undergird a very good board chair job description. But I said others because different groups may have other questions as well that they would like to kind of add to this list. So once you've done that, now you've kind of got the elements and the foundation for the definition of the role of the board chair, as well as a written board chair job description. There are a couple of other questions that you need to address. So first of all, will there be term limits for the position of the board chair? And if so, for all of the board officers. And this is a really important point because not only does it address effective governance and best practices governance, but it also percolates to influence the entire composition process for the board. So, for example, if you have term limits for the board chair, this implies that you're going to have frequent turnover in that position, and therefore many of the board members should be selected based on having the competencies to one day be a board chair. Conversely, if you do not have term limits for the position of board chair, and if the expectation is that an individual may serve in that role for 7, 9, 11 years or possibly even longer, then you would not want a stable of board members who have the characteristics and competencies to be a board chair because they're not going to be chosen as such, and they're likely to become very frustrated. So I would recommend to you that you say yes, you should have term limits for the position of board chair, and that this then is reflected in your selection criteria for board members. Boards who don't have term limits for their chairs really run a bunch of risks. First of all, prolonged ineffective leadership due to a personality-driven position, as we've talked about before, as opposed to one based on principle and policy. Second, the lack of term limits makes it very, very difficult for a board to intervene when a board chair's performance or behavior goes south. And I and my colleagues have seen many instances, many horror stories from the field where there was a good board chair, someone who was performing well, who did not have term limits, and then something happened in their life which caused them to change. The death of a spouse, the sale of a business, the being suddenly retired, and even mental illness. And now suddenly you have someone who's been a long-serving board chair, who's never had performance evaluation, who's never been subject to any formal feedback from the board, who starts behaving first, slightly inappropriately, and then the degree of inappropriateness grows, and it becomes very, very difficult for the board to intervene because they have no context for doing so. And this happens very, very frequently. And if you live by this sword, you will die by this sword. So the general consensus is that term limits for the position of board chair are a best governance practice, that they contribute to good governance. And one of the ways they do this is by forcing a board, typically assigned to its governance committee, to engage in ongoing, meaningful board leadership succession planning. If you have term limits for the position of board chair, you know that your current board chair must step down 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and therefore you really need to be thinking thoughtfully about who the next board chair will be. And this is part and parcel of good governance. On the other side of the coin, if you don't have term limits for the position of board chair, it's very common that boards get surprised when the board chair leaves because they weren't planning on this, and if the board chair didn't give notice, or if something bad happens like an illness or a death, the board can be left high and dry with no one in the wings who is prepared to step into the role of board chair. Typically, the term of office for a board chair is either 1 or 2 years, with a maximum limit of 2 or 3 consecutive terms. So let's talk about that. So best practice is you'll establish a term of office for the board chair. And the one I like is there's a 1-year term with a maximum of either 2 or 3 consecutive terms. And the reason I like this is because it forces then that term renewal becomes dependent upon some type of formal board chair performance evaluation process. And as I said earlier, we have another webinar that focuses on the board chair evaluation process. But it sends a couple of messages. Renewal of terms is not automatic. No individual is guaranteed serving more than 1 term. There is an expectation of evaluation, and there is also an expectation that if the performance of the board chair is not good, and let's stop right there. What does good mean? It means it's consistent with the established written job description for the board chair and any objectives for that position which have been established and communicated by the board. If the performance of the board chair is not good or inappropriate, it is possible that they will not be reappointed to a successive term. And so this is really what we're thinking about here, and it's basically the concept of leadership and evaluation. So what are some other issues related to creating the characteristics for a successful position of board chair? First is the development, once you've done what we've talked about, of a job description and answering questions about terms and term limits, is the development of a formal orientation process to the position of board chair and also for other board officers. And this is very important because frequently you will have individuals to this in this position who have previously served as board chair. And it's a very common human tendency to simply replicate the behavior that you've learned in the past. And if I was a board chair of a previous board, the way I behaved then may have been very appropriate in the context of that governance culture, but it may be less appropriate or even inappropriate in the context of the current governance culture of the hospital or system board, which I am now the chair of. So an orientation to the position, the expectation, the job descriptions, the term limits, the evaluation mechanisms, who has oversight responsibility for the chief executive officer, and so on, can be very useful in making explicit the role and the job of this position, and then help set the individual up for success right at the beginning. The second characteristic is a very structured board chair and board officer succession planning process, where the board is very, very clear about how new chairs are chosen. So let's talk about that one for a second. For really effective boards, the answer to the question, who should be the next board chair, is really considered and determined several years in advance before the current board chair is expected to hit their term limit. And, just as effective succession planning is crucial for the position of the chief executive officer, best practices boards have learned that it is especially important for the board itself. And what really surprises me and my colleagues is when we ask this question of boards, who will be the next board chair? It's surprisingly common that no one knows, that no one's really given that much thought, even when the current board chair is about to term out within a year. So ideally, you'll focus on this at least 1 year in advance. So what are some of the key steps in a good board chair succession planning process? The first one is you don't assume that the board chair job description is static. You identify future job requirements. How might the position of the board chair change in the future as a function of either environmental change or as a function of internal organizational change? So, for example, if the organization is growing, if you're acquiring other organizations, if you have joined another organization, if you're part of the merger craze and now suddenly you are a subordinate organization to another system, all of these issues will have major, major implications for governance roles and responsibilities, and therefore the same is true for the roles and responsibilities of the position of board chair. So how, based on these issues and based on internal feedback, how might the future job requirements change? And I'll give you an example. I have several clients where they will actually, in their board chair job description, have an expectation of time commitment. And several of them actually said, the position of the board chair should not take so much time that it can only be performed by an individual who is retired or is independently wealthy or who does not work or does not own a business. In other words, they have a policy goal, which is that the time requirement for the position of board chair should be so efficient that someone could be the board chair and work a full-time job or run a business. And in evaluating this, what a couple of these organizations found was that the position of the board chair was taking so much time that it was impossible to fulfill that policy goal. That the current board chairs were reporting, I can't do this and run my business, or I can't do this and maintain my job. And so we either need to change the job going forward, or you need to change this policy goal so that you recognize that it really cannot be performed by someone who is running a business or who has a full-time job. So that's an example of the kind of internal feedback that you will also get. So once you have this, then you start looking at the competencies that exist on the board to identify potential candidates for the board chair in the future. You then interview and try to determine an interest and try to get clarity on these competencies at least a year and preferably 2 before the current board chair would hit their term limit. Then develop profiles for the candidates, which are used to kind of determine the best candidate and to match the skills and behaviors of the individual to the expectations of the position, not just in terms of the static job description, but also relevant to what is required going forward. And another example of this would be, let's assume that you have a board chair who has a very good relationship with the chief executive officer, but the CEO has announced their retirement. And so one of the new jobs of the incoming board chair is going to be to preside over the search for the new CEO. And also then to help establish the dynamic relationship with the new chief executive officer. It's possible that this could require different skill sets, different communication skill sets, and so on, than those of the original board chair. So that then means once you've determined this, you then devise a personal development plan for the incoming board chair. This might involve rounding them out a little bit before they assume the position of board chair by asking them to serve on certain committees which they have not served on previously. And this is very important. You don't want the board chair to be a one-trick pony, to have only experience on one committee or on 2 committees, or be all focused on just finance, for example. You want the board chair to start getting a broader experience. And again, this is one of the benefits of term limits, is you can kind of require this personal development plan for a likely incoming board chair 1 or 2 years before they assume office. This also, you can start offloading some of the work of the current board chair onto the incoming board chair so that they can start working more closely with the chief executive officer or medical staff leaders to start building the relationships which are going to be crucial to making sure that they're effective as a board chair. And then also determining what leadership education they might need to get. You might require that an incoming board chair go get some education on a particular topic where their literacy on that topic needs to be upgraded. So once you've done that, you then also want to start thinking about possibly creating a position of chair-elect. Now, many boards will do this. They'll try to select this individual a year before they are expected to assume office for board chair. This then creates a formal position. It allows the current board chair to start offloading some work to the chair-elect, and it kind of creates the expectation that this is going to be the next board chair. Now, it's important to understand you don't want to necessarily make that automatic, and what many boards will do is they'll create a position of chair-elect, but then still require the board to approve that individual's ascension to the position of board chair. In other words, they'll say, all right, you're going to be chair-elect for a year. Here is your job as chair-elect, and there'll be a written job description and expectations. And then their performance will be evaluated so the board can say, did we make the right choice with this individual? If so, yep, let's approve them, and now they're board chair. If not, let's not make a bad mistake. We won't approve them, and we'll have to fit someone else into that slot. So those are some of the characteristics of effective board chairs, built on policy, not personality, built on principles, built on clear expectations, built on principles which recognize the authority of the board. And once you do this, then you can begin to rely on personality, but policy and principle trumps personality. And so I kind of leave you with this quote from Norman Schwarzkopf, who said, "Leadership is a potent combination of strategy and character, but if you must be without one, be without strategy." And talking about the importance of character, i.e. personality. And yes, it's important, but you cannot rely exclusively on that. Effective boards rely on policy, principle, process. So that concludes this webinar on the role of the board chair. I've left you with a couple of questions perhaps to get this ball rolling in your individual board. You might ask whether you have a written job description, whether it is used as the basis for orientation, whether it is meaningful, when was the last time it was updated, what's your approach to terms and term limits, do you have a clear board chair succession process? And that's a good question to ask every board member. Who will be the next board chair? And if you have a good, clear board chair succession planning process, everyone will know the answer to that question. If only a couple of individuals know the answer to that question, that indicates a less inclusive process and probably a dysfunctional balance of power. And then do you have and are you moving toward a performance evaluation process for the position of board chair? I hope this has been useful for you, and I thank you very much for your kind attention.